Welcome to the latest edition of the How I Teach podcast from Harvard Business Publishing. It's often been said that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. At Stanford University, one might describe Jack Fuchs' course on principled entrepreneurial decisions as trying to achieve the opposite effect, to help executives develop a robust decision-making process. To do this, Fuchs asks his students to create a core set of principles that allows them to adjust successfully to the many difficult and unexpected ethical decisions that they will face in their professional lives. In short, Fuchs hopes to instill his students with the ability to adapt in order to brave change and complexity. With a background in entrepreneurial decision-making that spans working in many roles in a variety of industries, from electric cars to genomics to consulting and venture capital, Jack Fuchs has a range of experience that informs his syllabus on entrepreneurship and animates classroom discussions. Jack, thanks so much for sharing your insights with our listeners.
Thank you, Mark.
So let's start with you. Could you give a little background about yourself and especially how it led to teaching this course?
I've always been a teacher at heart. Ever since I was a little kid, I loved teaching. I would teach my younger siblings things after I went to school every day. And even after working at McKinsey & Company for 2 years, right out of undergraduate, I taught high school for a year. I knew that I wanted to teach at some point in my career, and it gave me a chance to get to understand teaching at a young age. And so it was almost inevitable that after a career first at McKinsey & Company and Becton Dickinson and big companies, and then as I started to become an entrepreneur out at Stanford, I always really wanted to be someone who was a practitioner-oriented teacher, someone that would take his experiences from the world and bring them into a classroom setting. So about almost 20 years ago, I started lecturing at the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, and then over the past 8 or 9 years at the Graduate Engineering School at Stanford. It is a part of my life that I absolutely love, and I intend to continue to do more and more of it as my career progresses.
Right, so this is almost like a culmination of everything you've been doing, plus a very vocational thing, teaching. That's great. So I think this course is pretty popular, gets a lot of interest. What need is this filling with students?
Well, it seems to be more and more important all the time for entrepreneurs, for business people, for politicians, for everyone in our country and everyone in the world to have a clear set of values and principles as they embark on their careers. And what we do with the course is provide students with the tools to develop those values and principles that work for them. We strive not to impose some ethical construct on students. Rather, we want to provide a forum for students to develop their own approach to values and principles that they can bring as they leave Stanford.
Mm-hmm. And when did you first, get interested in values and principles as something that needed to be talked about more in a university setting?
Well, I would say that the course that I teach, Principled Entrepreneurial Decisions, is an outgrowth of two things. One is that after 15 years of teaching a course on forming entrepreneurial companies, on the very beginnings of the company and how do you get started, I had always wanted to teach a course in what happens when you're actually running a company. And so 4 or 5 years ago, I approached Tom Byers, who's the leader of Stanford's on STVP, it's called, which is the entrepreneurship organization there, about teaching a course on that. That's sort of why I'm teaching a course about how do you run an entrepreneurial company in some way.
Right.
The other side of this is on principles. All throughout my career, when I'm facilitating meetings and when I'm working with executives from different walks of life, I always talked about first establishing the guiding principles of the situation before trying to tackle the specifics of a situation. I'm not a very good golfer, but an old golf instructor once told me to let the big muscles do the work for the little muscles. If you establish guiding principles first, then when you try to tackle the difficult problem, you have a principle-based discussion about it rather than just a yes or a no, should we or shouldn't we take a certain course of action. So with that foundation, I then found myself sitting on a board of directors with Ray Dalio. It was an incredible honor to be on a board with him. And it was as his book and his publications were coming out on principles. And so what I wound up doing was adopting and adapting Ray Dalio's thoughts about principles to the world of entrepreneurship. So Tom and I considered those things, and then in conjunction with my co-instructor, Scott Sandell, who is the managing general partner of NEA, New Enterprise Associates, we developed this course that combines this idea of establishing values and principles as a method of helping you navigate through difficult entrepreneurial situations.
So I imagine that you may have observed the opposite, right? Where people didn't have their principles in line and hadn't thought them out. Is there a story or a moment where you said, "Oh my goodness, people really need to prepare for their ethical decision making"?
There are obvious and extremely kind of psychotic behaviors that people associate with Silicon Valley, and so absolutely at an extreme when you see the situation at Theranos, and when you think about the highly white male dominated approach of Silicon Valley that gets publicized, and you hear and see so many people stretching the truth or moving fast and breaking things to the extreme, and all of those things, whether it's WeWorks or Theranos or certain venture capital firms that have come into the press, all of those things are things that move you to want to do things differently. So I try for our course not to be about don't be psychotic. It's a little too obvious. What I'd rather teach with our course is a much more subtle thing, which is we believe that generally speaking, people do want to make the right decisions. They do have a sense of values and principles in and of themselves. They do tend to be mission driven. And we want to try to accentuate and make them the best entrepreneurs they can be, or frankly, whatever the course of experience they wind up having in their careers. And so we're more looking at the subtleties and trying to develop coursework and casework where there's no right or wrong answer. And so what I'm trying to help students do mostly is say there are lots of situations where it's hard to know the right answer, and your values and principles will then help inform and help you make a better decision when that situation arises.
How do you, start crafting a syllabus or curriculum to deal with this? And, what are the key concepts you'd like students to come away with?
Well, as any good entrepreneur, this has been an iterative process.
Right.
3 years ago, we developed the course, and that was sort of the first batch of pancakes, and was pretty good. And we continue to do it and develop it more and more, both in the United States, and we also teach this outside the United States as well. The first thing that we did was we decided on a framework where we talk about values and principles. Values are fundamental beliefs that help us understand what's right and wrong in our life and in our business pursuits. And those values and other experiences drive a set of principles. Principles are more idiosyncratic. Values can tend to be things like being customer-centric if you're a company.
Right.
Being open, being honest. They're usually things that it's hard to argue with, and they're relatively more generic. Principles are a little more specific to the company that you're trying to run. And of course, and by the way, we all as individuals have our principles. Companies have their principles, and communities have their principles. But we'll focus right now on the principles for companies. For those principles that a company has, we believe that if you have a good set of clearly thought out principles, that those principles will help inform your company's decision making. And that what you will do is you will, when faced with a difficult situation, you will prioritize your principles within the context of that situation, and that will help you make a better decision. And so what we do is what we did as a course was we try to develop a series of different things that would help students in developing their own values and principles, the values and principles that would be good for them. The first thing we set out to do was develop case studies. And so we have developed about 15 cases where sometimes very famous entrepreneurs and sometimes some not so famous entrepreneurs had to deal with difficult situations in their careers, in their companies. And we write a very brief 3 to 4 page case, a minimal information case that describes what was happening in that company. And then in front of the protagonist entrepreneur, the class discusses what they would do in the situation. Often there are then reveals in the cases. And then, of course, the entrepreneur comes up and tells us what the entrepreneur did in that setting. Right. But even more important, tells us why they did what they did. That became the foundation for the course, or those series of cases. And in fact, those were inspired by a course that was developed by Mark Leslie for the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. I think it's called Dilemmas and Decisions. And so I think as with any wonderful thing that's developed in academia, you borrow things from a lot of different sources. And so we started with those case studies. We then have expanded over the years. We've developed a series of frameworks that then help students understand the breadth of principles that they should be developing. And then we help them with those frameworks in teams, develop the principles that they would have if they were running a company. And then lastly, we've now developed a series of workshops and experiential learning modules, some role playing and things like that, where students can then put their principles to the test, to give them a chance to stress test and help their principles evolve and change based on putting them to use in difficult settings of their own that come up when you're running a company.
Right. So I saw in your syllabus you had about like 8 major topics you were going through, and then a capstone event or task. And so I'm just wondering, would it be possible to think about one particular week and that you either liked or has particular challenges, and that help people understand what you're doing as a teacher?
One of our typical classes will have the case discussion followed by the case protagonist reacting to the discussion and answering questions, and then followed by a workshop where the students are engaging in a prompt observed by, one team observes the other team as they're engaging in the prompt, and then they talk about how their principles evolve from that prompt. I'll just talk about 1 or 2 cases that might resonate with some people.
Super.
One case that is an organizationally oriented case, as you describe it, is a company where the CEO evidently read a lot of things on Quora about having a flat organization. And so the company had evolved to being 30 people, all of whom reported directly to the CEO effectively. He wanted to have a flat organization. He wanted to have no bureaucracy and no middle layers of management. And the CEO, as you can imagine, it maybe thinks it worked for him, right, but might not have. And so the class talks about the positives and negatives of that kind of a flat organization. And because it's about 3 or 4 weeks into the course, by this time, the students are already able to talk about it from their principles. They can talk about some of the organizational principles that they have developed, and they can talk about why that would or wouldn't work for them, what they would do in that setting. Then the next reveal comes, and one of the people at the company is so fed up that that person wants to become the CEO and thinks that he should be the CEO. And so then the next part of the case has to do with how that CEO wrestles with the situation where on the one hand, people will obviously think that that the person who wants to be CEO and isn't CEO, that's pretty confrontational of that person. But on the other hand, it's a demonstration that the person who is the CEO maybe is only playing some of the roles of the CEO properly. And so it evolves into a conversation about how do you split up a leadership role in some way such that you can, if you like, continue to be the CEO and do the things that you enjoy being as the CEO while allowing somebody else to play the other parts of the roles. So there's like these reveals, and it's a situation where actually it all works out pretty nicely for everybody involved, but it didn't have to work out that way, and it gives the students an opportunity to talk not just about what happens in the early stage of a company, which many of them are going to experience very soon, but then inevitably when the company grows up, how do you continue to act as a leader? After that case is done, we then have a particular organizational dilemma that comes up, and the students role play and do some observing about that role play. And that's a situation where 3 of you have decided to start a company together, and you all have decided to split the equity 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. And you are now 18 months into the company, and one of the 3 of you does not treat the company as the more than full-time job that it should be when you're a founder of a company. And what kind of conversation needs to ensue among the founders as you're trying to navigate through this situation? What principles do you have as a company that would lead you to be able to navigate that situation?
How about the capstone event? How does it help to really underline some of the things you're trying to teach?
So the capstone is effectively a series of assignments throughout the course that guides the students through a set of exercises where they first develop their own individual values and principles, and then in a team setting, they then establish the values and principles of their company, of a company that they're potentially going to start. And what we've heard from students, number one, is just having the lexicon, having the nomenclature to be able to understand their values and principles and to be able to be in touch with that is something that we hear back from students as being seminal to their development. But what we love is that they leave the class with a starter set of these principles that they would use if and when they're going to be running a company. And many times those people then infect other people, whether they wind up going to a very small company as their first job, or down the road they wind up working with a small company. They will then sometimes be a catalyst for that company developing their values and principles. I'm always looking for leverage, right? And what I'm trying to do is instill the sense in these students, which then they can bring to other people in their careers.
That's got to be satisfying to see that grow like that. Can you recall 1 or 2 really surprising moments you may have had in class? Any reveals from the students or things you learned that you didn't expect?
Well, I would say that almost everything that we've developed in the class is thanks to the students. The students are constantly helping us with feedback. They're constantly helping us as they're describing things. One of the things that we talk about a lot as a class are why do we do this values and principles stuff? What do principles actually do for us? And to a certain extent, students have helped us develop the framework for why and how we use principles. The first point is be explicit about your values and principles, because by being explicit, they will help you manage decisions more efficiently and effectively. The second is that you will then evolve your principles, and you will prioritize your principles within the context of a decision. And that idea, there's 4 of these ideas, but that second idea, that came directly from one of the students.
Oh, wow.
which is to say that your principles will conflict. By definition, if you are doing an effective job with principles, you will have a series of principles that will come into conflict when you are trying to figure out what to do in a difficult situation. what you want to do is prioritize those principles within the context of a specific situation,
Right.
which will then give you a sense of which way to go in that situation. In another situation, those principles may have been prioritized differently.
Right.
I will also say that this is where I don't want to get myself into trouble, but some companies, I believe, do not have a broad enough set of principles. Some companies, they may have one or two or a few very important principles, but they are extremely on one side of an equation. If your principles don't come into conflict, you do not have a broad enough set of principles as a company. If you want to have a principle about customer engagement, for example, and that is the most important principle, it's your only principle, it's going to be easy for people to make decisions, but you perhaps need another principle about free speech. And what does free speech mean? Or another principle about your customers' privacy. And so you can imagine that when met with a difficult decision, you have to weigh the customer's privacy against free speech, against customer engagement, against some of your financial principles. And it's not an easy answer, but you have a dialogue and a discussion over time.
Right.
The third thing that I have is communicate your principles explicitly. What I like to say is that principles scale. Effective communication of your principles allow your organization to scale over time. When it's just you as a founder of a company, you kind of have a sense of your values and principles, and that's straightforward. When it's maybe just you and a co-founder or two that are spending 15 hours a day together, again, it's probably relatively straightforward, but eventually you're going to have hundreds or thousands of people in your company. If you have communicated your principles explicitly, then people throughout your organization will tend to make better decisions, will tend to make decisions more aligned with the way that you would want them to be made.
Right.
And then lastly, execute according to your principles to accelerate your growth. Basically, walk the talk. I'm struck with the fact that Google every year surveys its employees to ask them whether they are making their decisions consistent with the values of the company. One of the things that's most important in an entrepreneurial company is for the people who work at that company to perceive that people are making decisions along the lines of the values and the principles of the company.
I'm really struck by your balancing of values which sound more permanent or more universal, and then principles which are more particular, and always having a negotiation between those two things. Do students find that difficult to figure out?
Yeah, I think it is. This is a journey. It's a 10-week journey for the students with the capstone part of the course to develop their values and principles as individuals and develop the values and principles of the team as a team. But it's also a journey throughout the case studies that we do from the beginning of the course, when students are often just arguing about, well, would you have done the product recall or wouldn't you have done the product recall? And they're just arguing back and forth about whether they would or they wouldn't, or they're trying to find the data in the case that proves one way or the other. And then they evolve from that over the arc of the course. And by the middle of the course, they have more of a sense of their own values and principles. And when they're answering the question about whether they would fire this employee or whether they would lay off half of their company or all kinds of other difficult things that we wrestle with in the course, they're leading more with their principles. They're saying, because we are a company that communicate, we've decided we are going to share information with our employees. We're going to err on the side of overly sharing information with our employees. We would be inclined to do things this way, and then someone else can disagree with them because of some other principle, and then we can have a principle-based discussion as a class. So, so people develop more of an understanding. In fact, I usually start out the first class by saying, let's not get hung up on what's a value, what's a principle, what's culture, what's a mission, what's a vision. Let's just talk about things. Let's just go. And then over the course of time, they develop more of an appreciation and understanding for the distinction between fundamental values that tell you about what's right and wrong, and principles which more directly influence the decision that you have to make. Again, over time, we introduce frameworks and concepts that help people make sure that their principles are well formed, things that will help people understand what makes a good principle. We introduce frameworks that are not necessarily mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, but some frameworks that give people a breadth of trying to understand all the different kinds of principles that they should develop. And so again, over the course of the 10 weeks, the students are introduced to more and more frameworks that help those principles evolve, such that by the time they're done with the 10 weeks, then they're really a tight first set of principles for them.
Right. And I imagine it's that subtlety that needs to be understood and respected, which requires you to do this over, say, 10 or 11 weeks rather than 1 or 2.
Right. Especially given that this is not a course in ethics per se. It's not a course in trying to help inform students of some ethical framework. It's a course trying to help students develop their own framework.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it takes a few weeks to teach the lexicon of what we mean by values and principles. And then it takes a few weeks for them to develop their own values and principles. And then it takes a few weeks for them to develop the company's values and principles. And then a few weeks to then stress test those values and principles with the last part of that capstone assignment.
Wow, it sounds interesting. I'm ready to take this course.
One of the reasons that I was very happy to talk to you today is that we have, at the moment, it's just us teaching the course, but we're not only going to publish these cases, but we also have elaborate teaching notes and video. We've done some video clips of some of the guest speakers that have spoken at our class. And so we're trying to do as much as possible to disseminate this.
Get the word out, huh?
Make people aware that this is available. And it's just starting. We're just beginning to do some publishing of these cases.
Now, when you're teaching these values, right, you can get really personal sometimes, and especially if people are just sort of first coming to some sort of sophisticated consciousness about their own values. I'm sure they can get really emotional or heated. So I'm wondering, what happens when things get heated within your class, or have you found ways to guard against too much personal sort of either attacks or accusations or things like that? How you deal with the emotional side of these principles and values?
We are fortunate enough to have a lot of applicants to our course. We accepted about 130 students in the course this year into two sections. What we try to screen for in the applications is whether the students are going to be open to that kind of confrontational dialogue. And so we want to make sure that we do as good a job as possible helping students understand and appreciate that there is going to be that conflict in the class. And we also try to screen our case protagonists to do the same. We have a wonderful business leader in the pharmaceutical industry, Bruce Kozad from Jazz Pharmaceuticals, comes in and shares some pretty deep emotional stuff about some of the tough times that he had in his company. And we have students that will ask him, how can you possibly work in an industry like the pharmaceutical industry, or have some pretty confrontational stuff? But we've screened to have guest speakers who are willing to engage with students at that kind of a level. And I knew he would respond well to that question. And we foster that in our class. We make sure that the guests are ready to be pushed. And you're absolutely right. We have many times that it gets kind of emotional in different ways. One of my favorite moments, Ray Dalio has been generous enough with his time to speak at our class for the past couple of years, and he's expected to be speaking again at our class. And he does a program where he helps the students develop their own values and principles, and then works with the students individually to discuss those values and principles. There's a step-by-step process that he actually has developed. And so the students then come up and he talks to the students in front of the entire class. And he talked to the student about how he was wrestling with dropping out of school because one of his parents had been diagnosed with cancer and the other parent was very sick, and they were living in Mexico at the time, and he needed to be with them probably, and trying to wrestle with this situation. And it was just an incredibly difficult situation for him. And that student came up with a principle that Ray loved. It was, every situation can be a blessing. So the student had taken all of the difficult situation in his life, and he had developed a principle that every situation can be a blessing. And Ray was really taken with that. And it's something that struck me as well. And it's something I'm sure that other students in the class were touched by that. But the idea of someone exposing themselves so much to that kind of personal pain, and yet turning it into something that can be inspirational even to people, I think was very special.
I guess a sub-theme of that would be resilience, right? How do we get through these troubles and come out better, or at least, prepared for the next step?
I think that's right.
Well, in the spirit of spreading the gospel of doing this sort of nuanced decision-making, taking into account your values and the principles where they get expressed, I imagine, many other business disciplines would be interested in getting some of the things that you're talking about and applying it to, accounting and leadership and, operations and things like that, all these situations where tough decisions come up. How might teachers of other disciplines integrate some of the things you're emphasizing?
Yes, I do agree with you that the general idea of establishing principles that then drive decisions is transferable to many different disciplines. I would say that one of the best things about our course is that I doubt even a majority of the 130 students in our course are going to found companies when they graduate or even shortly after they graduate. But wherever they go in whatever career they pursue, I think that the idea of being more intentional about the values and principles in any group, in any setting, in any career is a real positive. We have a series of frameworks that are not particular to entrepreneurship that help guide people through establishing and developing and prioritizing their values, and then from the values and their experiences, developing a set of principles. And we can make that material available to anybody that would like it. Yes, there's some of what we do that is specific to entrepreneurship, but to be able to weave in some element of principles into any course that you're teaching, I think would be fantastic. You can imagine that you can apply this to many different aspects of principles come in many different forms. There are things that are very popular because of things that are in the press right now. There are certain kinds of principles that are particularly popular, but this can be applied to many different walks of life.
Absolutely. Well, I think the indication about how rich this course is all of the interesting issues I can imagine that you're bringing up, and all the deep discussions in each week.
Yeah, and whether it's a decision about whether Parler should be allowed on the App Store or not, whether it's trying to figure out why some companies that maybe have always seemed to have really good values and principles wind up losing their way at some point. If I had an infinite amount of time to develop more courses, I could imagine trying to develop something about how and why companies lose their way, or how do you continue to instill those values and principles in an organization as you're handing over leadership to generation after generation. Obviously in public service, how do you establish values and principles that help drive to better decisions in public service? So you could imagine a lot of different areas that this would come in, and even in the most mundane situation, a project team in a course, or a project team in a company, but even a project team in a course at Harvard, there are values and principles of that project team, whether they're stated or unstated. What do you do if one of the people isn't pulling their weight? How do you make decisions? Do you make decisions by consensus? Do you make decisions by vote? Is there a leader who ultimately makes decisions? Who holds people accountable? What are you striving for? What level of excellence are you striving for? What will you err on the side of doing? In every situation, there are principles at work. The question is sort of how intentional are you about them? How well are they communicated? How well are they understood by everybody involved?
Mm-hmm.
One kind of parting thought, I think that we think about values and principles at an individual level, at a personal level. We think about values and principles at a company level, and we can also think about them at a community level. But when I look back on my career, the times when I've been at the most uncomfortable is when the values and principles of a company that I'm working with or an organization that I'm working with are too dissimilar from my own personal values and principles. I think that there needs to be some congruence between the values and principles that you have and the values and principles that an organization has. They don't have to be the same. I mean, you're not going to run your family the same way that you run a company, but there needs to be some congruence between those two. And the more congruent they are, I think the more comfortable and the more happy we all are in our careers.
And those kind of decisions are really important for students who you're teaching. That's a great way to end this discussion. I'm glad that we touched on all these great issues. Thanks a lot.